The Veth had a word for the strip of scorched rock between the two trench lines. Loosely translated, it meant the space where the unworthy wait to finish dying. Sergeant Dara Voss had been waiting in it for 6 hours. She'd found the trench by accident, or rather, by the specific kind of luck that meant your entire fire team was dead, and you were the only one small enough to throw yourself flat into a drainage cut while the Veth pulse cannons swept the ridge. She hit the mud face first. She stayed there. She listened to the sound of her squad being turned into components. The ridge assault had been Intel Section's idea. Intel Section had been wrong. They always were in the Veth corridor. The intelligence on Veth movement patterns in this sector was 14 months old, compiled before the Veth had switched to the new cloaking resonance that ate sensor pings like a dead star ate light. What looked like open ground on the tactical map had been a kill box for 2 years. Every unit that came through learned this the same way Voss's unit had learned it, from the inside. She'd crawled 30 meters through fog, dense enough to chew, before she found the trench lip. Old construction, human actually, left over from the first Veth push 4 years ago, when the free colonies had still believed the Veth could be negotiated with. The earthworks were half collapsed. A rusted support strut stuck out at an angle like a broken finger. The trench smelled of wet clay and something older, something that had been wet clay a long time ago and was now something else entirely. Voss dropped in, drew her sidearm, swept the dark, empty. She let herself breathe, for about 15 seconds. Then the other soldier dropped in from the opposite end. He was Kavosi. She could tell from the breathing mask, the blue-gray combat suit, the rank markings on his collar. He was also pointing a pulse rifle at her face, and she was pointing her sidearm at his, and for a long moment neither of them did anything at all. His name, she would learn later, was Corporal Ren Akayev. He was 24 years old. He had a sister on Kavosi Prime who kept fish in a roof garden. He'd been in the Veth corridor for 8 months. He was like her, the only survivor of a fire team ambushed in the fog, and he had found this trench by the same specific variety of catastrophic luck. Right now, he was just a face behind a breathing mask and a gun. Kavosi, she said, stating a fact. Free colonies, he said, returning the favor. They stood there in the ruined trench, while the fog turned orange with distant fire, and the Veth pulse cannons continued their slow, methodical sweep of the ridge above. It was Akayev who lowered his rifle first. Not all the way, he kept it at a diagonal, ready. A gesture that meant, I am not pointing this at you. It does not mean I trust you. It means I have identified the more immediate problem. Voss matched the angle. We're in the middle, she said. Yes, both sides will shoot us. Yes, the Veth will definitely shoot us. Also yes. She holstered the sidearm. He didn't lower the rifle all the way, but he let his grip ease slightly. She took that as the operational equivalent of a handshake. Voss, she said. Akayev. Neither of them offered a hand. The trench was only 1.5 meters wide. The Kavosi separatist movement had been a thorn in free colony administration for 11 years before the Veth arrived. The war between them had been small and grinding and ugly in the particular way that civil conflicts are ugly. Familiar faces on both sides of the wire. Old neighborhoods shelled by people who'd grown up in them. Propaganda that everybody knew was propaganda and believed anyway, because believing was easier than the alternative. When the Veth came, neither side stopped fighting. They just acquired a second war layered over the first and fought both simultaneously with the exhausted efficiency of people who had forgotten what not fighting felt like. Voss had been 12 years old when the Veth first made contact. She remembered the broadcasts, the Veth communicators broadcasting on every frequency, a sound like tearing metal, harmonized with something almost musical, the translation algorithms working overtime to produce something approximating language. The first translated message had been a statement of territorial claim. The second had been a demand for withdrawal. The third had been a demonstration. 3 colony ships dissolved at the atomic level live on every feed in the settled systems. After that, there were no more messages. The Veth did not negotiate. They had made their position clear. They found repetition inefficient, and they had moved on to implementation. Akayev had been 16, old enough to understand what it meant. Old enough to watch his father leave on the first Kavosi defense fleet and not come back. They didn't discuss any of this in the first hour. They discussed immediate logistics, water, ammunition, the wound on Voss's left forearm that she'd been ignoring since the ambush, and that Akayev pointed out was still bleeding with the flat tone of someone filing a report. She let him wrap it with the field dressing from his kit because his hands were steadier than hers, and because accepting help from someone who might try to kill you later was still accepting help. And she was a practical woman. "You have anything to eat?" he asked. "Half a ration bar. I have a third of one." They split both portions into approximate halves and ate in silence, watching opposite ends of the trench, backs to the earthen wall. The fog was beginning to thin. That was a problem. In fog, the trench was invisible from above. Without fog, a Veth sensor pass would light them up like a signal fire. "How long since your last contact?" Voss asked. 4 hours. You? 6, maybe 7. They'll notice we're missing. They'll think we're dead." He was quiet for a moment. "They'll be mostly right." The third soldier was not dead. They found him in the forward dugout. A small earthen pocket cut into the wall of the trench where someone had once sheltered from a bombardment. He was a Free Colony's private named Tessov, and they found him because he made a sound. A long, low, breathy moan, like a man dreaming something he didn't want to dream. Voss went in first with her light. Tessov was on his back, eyes half open, chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of someone deep in shock. Both his legs were intact. His suit was torn at the shoulder. There was dried blood on his face from a head wound, mostly crusted. "Alive," she said. To herself, really. Akayev appeared at the dugout entrance behind her. Looked at Tessov, looked at her. "Free Colonies?" "Yes." "Is he breathing?" "Unconscious." "Head injury, probably concussive." Akayev crouched at the entrance, studying the man with a careful expression. "Not hostile, just careful." "Can he be moved?" "I don't know yet." "Give me a minute." She ran her light over Tessov's body. Standard field assessment, looking for bleeds, fractures, anything that would kill him faster than the situation already threatened to. She found what she was looking for when she reached his back. She stopped. "Akayev." "What?" "Don't touch him. Don't let him move." "Don't," she exhaled slowly. "There's a Veth compression mine under his back." Silence. The Veth compression mines were a specific category of cruelty. Not because the Veth were cruel. They weren't. Particularly, they were simply efficient. But because the mine's design made perfect sense from an engineering standpoint and was therefore all the more horrifying. It worked on pressure differential. Compressed by weight, it armed. Released from weight, it detonated. The purpose was to create a trap that could not be disarmed without triggering it. The purpose was to make a problem out of a body. Tessov had been placed on it deliberately. Someone had done this to him while he was unconscious. Voss sat back on her heels and looked at the man who could not move and was not yet dead, and felt something cold settle in her chest that she recognized as rage, but that she was going to file under problem solving. For now, because rage was not useful in a 1-meter trench with a live mine. "Can it be disarmed?" Akayev asked from the entrance. "Not by me. Not without a Veth ordnance kit and 3 hours, and probably a qualified engineer. None of which we have. None of which we have." Another silence, longer this time. "So he just stays there," Akayev said, "unless someone comes for us." She looked at Tessov's face. His eyes were moving behind the lids now. He was coming up toward consciousness, slow as a diver rising toward light. "He's going to wake up," she said, "and when he does, he can't move. And he's going to know it." She'd been in the corridor for 16 months. She thought she'd gotten past the point where things could make her feel sick. She found out she hadn't. Tessov woke up in stages. First, the breathing changed. Then the eyes opened, unfocused, staring at the earthen ceiling of the dugout. Then he tried to move, and Voss put her hand firmly on his shoulder and said, "Don't," in the tone that carries its own explanation. And he looked at her face and read something in it, and he stopped. "What's under me?" he said, not a question. "Compression mine, Veth pattern." He processed that. She watched him process it, his jaw tightened. His hands, which had started to push against the earth, went flat and still. "Okay," he said, very quiet. "Okay. We're working on options." "What options are there?" "We get help in, or we find a way to substitute your weight with something equivalent." "We're working on it." He didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Who's the Kavosi?" She'd half forgotten Akayev was visible from where Tessov lay. "Corporal Akayev. He's stranded same as us." Tessov's eyes moved to Akayev. Something passed across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not hatred exactly. More like the expression of a man who has discovered that his situation contains an additional complication. "Great," he said. "He's not shooting at you," Voss said. "Yet." Akayev agreed, from the entrance. His tone was so level it took her a second to realize it might have been a joke. Tessov did not joke. Tessov talked, quietly, in the controlled way of someone managing pain by keeping their mind occupied. And what he talked about, mostly, was the question of who had started this. Not the war with the Veth, the other one. The Kovosi hit the Callaway station first, he said. That's just a fact. I was there. I was 14. My aunt worked supply manifest. I watched the feeds. Callaway Station was a military installation, Akayev said. The free colonies had been running weapons through it for 6 months. To defend against us specifically, yes. It was a forward depot. We hit a depot. You hit a civilian transit hub that happened to share infrastructure with. The infrastructure was military. The classification was civilian because your administration. It doesn't matter, Voss said. Both of them stopped. It doesn't matter, she said again. The Veth don't care. They were coming regardless. We were already fighting regardless. The question of who threw the first rock in a fire that size is, she stopped herself. It's just a question. It doesn't lead anywhere. Tesov was quiet. Then it matters to me. I know, she said. It matters to me too, but not right now. Akayev had his rifle laid across his knees. He was looking at the fog, thinning still, the far ridge becoming visible in gray outline. My unit, he said. There were 6 of us. We went into the fog following a sensor ghost. The Veth fed it to us deliberately. Spoofed a free colony advance so we'd move into their kill zone. He paused. They used us, both of us, as targets for each other at first, then as targets for themselves. Nobody said anything. They're very patient, he said. They have time, Voss said. They've been doing this for longer than our written history. The Veth had been encountered, at first contact, in the posture of a civilization that had already absorbed 16 other species' territories across 4-star systems. Not destroyed them, absorbed. Converted their infrastructure, repurposed their surviving populations as labor-class units in the collective, filed their cultural data in archives that no independent researcher had ever been permitted to access. They approached human space with the unhurried efficiency of something that had done this before and fully expected to do it again. What they had not accounted for, what their models had apparently not included, was how badly humans refused to file. The signal was Akayev's idea. He'd been thinking about it for 2 hours by the time he said it aloud, which was exactly the amount of time it took him to find a version of the idea that he wasn't ashamed to suggest. The neutrals have a monitoring station at the Caveth Relay, he said. The Intercessory Council. They track combat emissions in this sector. They're required to under the Meridian Accord, which both sides signed. Which is why neither side follows it, Tesov said. Doesn't matter. They monitor. If we can generate a coherent distress emission on the Accord frequency, they won't come in, Voss said. The Accord prohibits intercessory forces from entering active combat zones. The Accord prohibits them from engaging in combat. Being present in a zone is technically permitted as long as they operate under ceasefire protocols. He looked at her. There's a difference. You know the Accord well. My unit's been fighting the Accord for 2 years. You know your enemy's weapons. She looked at him for a moment. Then, despite everything, fair. The distress emitter was a standard piece of kit. Every soldier carried one, small as a thumb, designed to broadcast on emergency frequencies when activated. The Accord frequency was adjacent. With a fieldcraft modification, rerouting the crystal through a secondary resonance coil, which Akayev described in the patient tone of someone who'd had to improvise communications under fire before, the emitter could be made to broadcast on both. The modification took 40 minutes, most of it Voss's hands because Akayev's left hand had a tremor from a shrapnel hit he hadn't mentioned until she noticed it. When did that happen? She asked. Ambush. It's fine. It's not fine. It will be fine when we're somewhere other than this trench. She finished the modification. Activated the emitter. Set it in the crook of the rusted strut at the trench lip. Pointed toward the sky. They waited. The response came in 47 minutes. A tight beam acknowledgement on the Accord frequency. Terse and bureaucratic, requesting identification and status. Voss responded. Silence. Then a longer message. Intercessory forces were aware of the situation. Intercessory forces were consulting with the relevant command authorities regarding a potential observation mission to the location. Intercessory forces wished to remind all parties that any such mission would be conducted strictly under the terms of the Meridian Accord and did not constitute intervention. They're covering themselves, Akayev said. They always cover themselves. Will they come? Voss thought about the Intercessory Council, the neutral system coalition that had been trying to broker a human-on-human ceasefire for 8 years and failing at it, that monitored the Caveth corridor from a station nobody had ever attacked, because attacking it would be an admission that you didn't want witnesses. She thought about the 18 clauses in the Accord that could be interpreted as preventing action, and the 2 that could be interpreted as permitting it, and the specific kind of bureaucratic courage it took to read the 2 instead of the 18. Maybe, she said, it was Tesov who said the thing none of them wanted to say. He'd been quieter in the last hour, conserving energy, keeping still, managing the mind beneath him with the focused stillness of a man who had identified the thing that was going to kill him and had chosen, moment to moment, not to let it. If the intercessory comes, he said, the Veth will know we're here. Yes, the Veth don't respect the Accord. No, so the moment we have people coming to help us, we also have a targeting solution painted on us. Voss and Akayev looked at each other. Yes, she said. Tesov exhaled slowly. Okay, he said. Good, let them come. I'm tired of being a secret. There was a journalist. This was, in retrospect, predictable. The intercessory monitoring station at Kaveth Relay served as an unofficial media hub for the dozen or so independent correspondents who covered the corridor war for the settled systems feeds. When the intercessory began moving an observation team toward the coordinates, one of those correspondents, a woman named Sina Chio, who represented the Meridian Independent Press and had been covering the corridor for 3 years, intercepted the movement order and followed it. She arrived ahead of the intercessory unit in a civilian scout ship moving under press credentials, broadcasting on the open channel, and the first thing she did was start transmitting. 3 soldiers, her broadcast began, 2 different sides of a civil war, and a third between them who cannot move, and something the Veth do not have a word for, happening in the space between. Voss heard this on the emergency receiver and thought, someone is going to get us killed. And also, someone is going to make sure that what happens here is seen. Both things were true. The intercessory team was a 4-person unit under a neutral systems officer named Commandant Priya Hasseldine. She had short gray hair and the look of someone who had been disobeying orders from above for long enough that it no longer cost her anything internally. She came down into the trench personally, leaving her team at the perimeter, and she looked at Tesov lying on the mine, and she looked at Voss and Akayev, and she said, I've brought an ordnance technician. Can they disarm it? Voss asked. Hasseldine was quiet for a moment. They're going to try. The technician's name was Wren. They were young, professionally calm, and extremely honest. They took one look at the mine configuration and said, this is a Veth Mk7 compression unit. The disarm protocol requires a matched resonance key that was programmed at manufacture. Without the key, I cannot disarm it. A pause. I can tell you that very precisely. Then what can you do? Tesov asked. Flat voice. No accusation in it, just the question. I can attempt a weight substitution procedure. It has a 40% success rate under field conditions. What happens in the 60%? It detonates. The trench was very quiet. What are our other options? Voss said. Wren looked at her. You don't have other options. This is the only one. They were setting up the weight substitution rig, a framework of support struts and compressed mass modules that would need to be slid under Tesov's back simultaneously as he rolled clear, the kind of procedure that required perfect timing and at least 3 sets of hands. When the Veth fired, not at the trench, not yet, at the intercessory ship on the ridge, a single pulse, surgical and complete, that converted the ship's forward section into slag in the time it took to process the sound of the impact. The press feed went dark for 11 seconds. Then Sina Cho's voice came back, still transmitting, still broadcasting, her voice entirely steady. The Veth have fired on a neutral vessel operating under Meridian Accord protections. I want to be clear that this is happening. I want the settled systems to know this is what is happening right now. The broadcast went to every feed in human space, all of them. The intercessory protocols required it. Any attack on an Accord vessel triggered an automatic broadcast cascade to every monitored system on the network. It was a safeguard against exactly this kind of erasure. Commandant Hasseldine got on her communicator. Her voice was quiet and precise. Command, this is Hasseldine. We have confirmed Accord-prohibited aggression. I am invoking Article 7. A pause while someone on the other end said something. Yes, I understand. I am invoking Article 7 regardless. Article 7 was the clause that nobody invoked because invoking it required you to stay in the combat zone under fire until the situation was resolved. Article 7 existed because someone had once understood that bearing witness was not a passive act. Above them, the Veth began to move. Akayev heard them first, His breathing mask had better sensor sensitivity than her equipment, and he went still in the specific way that soldiers go still when they're processing input that their body has recognized before their mind has. "There are 3 units moving on the eastern approach," he said, cloaked, "but moving fast enough that the resonance shimmer is visible." "How long?" 8 minutes. "Maybe 10. Ren looked at the rig. "I need 6, then do it in 6, Voss said. What happened next was the kind of thing that doesn't compress into narrative cleanly. The procedure was technical and frantic and required 3 people working in a space designed for 1. And Tesov lying still through all of it, with his eyes open and his hands flat against the earth, completely motionless, with the particular stillness of a person who has identified the exact cost of any other choice and has paid it in advance. His breathing was controlled. His face was pale and entirely composed. At one point, while Ren was positioning the primary support strut, Voss was close enough to Tessov's face that she could hear him very quietly, almost below the threshold of speech, and it took her a moment to realize he was counting. Not counting down, not counting up, just counting 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Steady, continuous, keeping himself in the present moment by making the present moment something he could measure. She had learned to count the same way in her 2nd year in the corridor. Her drill sergeant had taught her. She'd thought it was a coping technique specific to their unit. She looked at Tessov's moving lips and thought, "We came up with the same thing, independently, because we're the same species and the same thing helps us." "Ready," Ren said. "On my mark," Voss said. It worked. Not perfectly. The frame settled slightly wrong, and Tessov had to roll faster than planned. And there was a moment, approximately a quarter of a second, when neither the frame nor Tessov's weight was fully contacting the mind's sensor plate. A moment where the Veth engineering and the Veth certainty about how this would end were absolutely correct. Tessov made it to the trench wall. The frame held. Akayev caught him, put his shoulder under Tessov's arm without being asked, braced him against the earthen wall, and Tessov grabbed Akayev's arm and said something in his own dialect that Voss didn't speak, but that she recognized as the sound of a man telling another man thank you in a way he couldn't quite make himself say directly. The Veth units were 5 minutes out. "We need to move," Hasseldine said. She was already on the communicator, calling in the observation team's extraction vehicle. "There's a hardened shelter 600 meters northeast, old free colony construction, still in the registry as a protected site. Under the Accord, the Veth cannot engage us there without additional escalation protocols. The Veth are escalating right now," Voss said. "The Veth are escalating in a way that Sina Cho is broadcasting to every inhabited system in this sector," Hasseldine said. "There is a difference. There was. She was right. The Veth calculated everything: resource cost, probability matrices, territorial gain, efficiency ratios. What they were not calibrating for in this moment was how many human eyes were on this piece of scorched rock. How many humans in how many systems were watching a correspondent whose voice had not shaken when the ship was hit, describing 3 soldiers, 2 former enemies, and a man who should have been a corpse, moving out of a trench they should never have survived. The Veth were watching a battlefield. Sina Cho was showing the settled systems a story. There was a calculation difference. They moved. They didn't all make it clean. The Veth got a targeting solution on the group 200 meters from the shelter. The pulse cannon that fired was ranged, a precision shot, not a sweep, and it took the extraction vehicle and the back half of the intercessory team's equipment. Hasseldine lost 2 support personnel. Voss took shrapnel across her right shoulder that she didn't process as pain for approximately 45 minutes because she was moving too fast for the information to matter. They reached the shelter, sealed the doors. The Veth held at the perimeter, calculating. They would breach eventually. Every human in the shelter knew this. The shelter's Accord designation bought them time, not safety. It was in the shelter that things came apart. It started small. Tessov was pale and shaking from shock in the mine and the sprint, and Akayev gave him water from his own kit. And one of the remaining intercessory personnel, a young man, barely 20, processing the deaths of his colleagues, saw this and said something low and ugly about Kovosi soldiers and what they could do with their water. Tessov told him to stop. He didn't stop. Akayev said nothing. His face did something that Voss recognized as the expression of a man who has heard his people described in a specific way so many times that his body has learned to absorb it like a strike. Then the young intercessory man said the thing, the specific thing, About the Callaway Station, about Kovosi forces, the version of the thing that had been said in every civilian feed and every political broadcast for 11 years, and Akayev stood up. Voss got between them. "No," she said. I know what he said." "No." Akayev looked at her. His eyes were very dark and very still. "You don't get to tell me." "I get to tell you exactly that," she said. "In this room. Right now, we are not doing this here." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The Veth are outside. The Accord is the only thing keeping that door closed. If we start fracturing in here, they will know it. They can read stress signatures through the walls. They will know when we stop being a unit and start being a collection of individuals who hate each other, and that is when they will breach. She looked at all of them. We are not going to give them that. Sina Cho was still broadcasting. She'd moved to the shelter's emergency uplink, a hardline antenna that the Veth couldn't jam without breaching another Accord protocol, which would trigger another cascade. The Veth were clearly aware of this. The Veth were, apparently, deciding how many escalation protocols they wanted to burn on this particular rock. Every calculation they made was being watched. On the Meridian Independent feed, in the waiting rooms of intercessory stations, in civilian quarters, on Free Colony and Kovosi worlds alike, on all of them, people were watching. Sina Cho had a voice that didn't perform calm. It simply was calm. The calm of someone who had decided that the truth told clearly was the most useful thing she could offer. And she offered it without embellishment, without fear, in the flat and sturdy language of a person who understood that witness was not a small act. She described the trench. She described the mine. She described the weight substitution, and the run across the rock, and the shrapnel and the door of the shelter. She described Tesov's hands, flat and still against the earth. She described Akayev's shoulder under Tesov's arm. She described the argument inside the shelter, and she described Voss standing between two men with a voice that didn't need volume. She said, "I want you to understand what I'm watching. Not the trench, not the Veth at the perimeter. I want you to understand what I'm watching in this room. 3 soldiers who had every structural reason to let each other die, and didn't. I have been covering human conflict for 11 years. I have seen what humans do to each other with enough motivation and enough ideology and enough fear. I am telling you right now that I have also seen this. A man from one side giving water to a man from the other, in a room that might not last the night. I am telling you that both things are true about us. I think it matters which one we decide to lead with." The Veth breached at 340. 3 units, cloak dropped. The shelter door converted to vapor in under a second. They came in fast. 4-limbed, armored in the layered composite that absorbed standard pulse fire, carrying the resonance weapons that disrupted human nervous system function without causing permanent damage because permanent damage was inefficient, and compliant labor units were valuable. Voss was ready, not with a weapon, with the uplink. She'd spent 2 hours preparing it with Ren, the intercessor tech, whose professional calm had not cracked once through any of it. The uplink, hardwired into the shelter's power supply, was broadcasting on every Accord frequency simultaneously. Every move the Veth made inside the shelter was being transmitted, every action, every second. The Veth were very good at warfare. They had been doing it for 10,000 years. They had a model for every human response: the fight, the flight, the negotiation, the surrender. They had defeated 16 species with those models. What they did not have a model for was this: a species that had decided, in the specific place where it was most cornered, that the most dangerous thing it could do was make sure everyone was watching. The lead Veth unit paused inside the shelter entrance. Its sensor array, the cluster of receptor organs arranged around what passed for a head, swept the room, processed the uplink signal, processed the fact of the broadcast, processed the fact that every action taken in this room in the next 60 seconds would be transmitted to approximately 4 billion watching humans across 6-star systems. A very long 3 seconds passed. The Veth unit transmitted a signal to its partners. A Veth communication Voss's translation module rendered as probability matrix non-optimal. Withdraw and reassess. They left. The door was still vapor. Cold air came in from the Kaveth dark. Nobody moved for almost a minute. Then Tesov started counting again under his breath. 3, 4, 5, 6. And Akayev started laughing. Not a happy sound. Not exactly. More the sound of a person whose body has run out of adrenaline and has decided to release the remaining pressure as laughter because the alternative is worse. And Hasseldine got on her communicator in her quiet, precise voice and called in an actual extraction, a real one. Armed escort, Article 7 invocation still active. And she said, "Tell them to move fast. We have a door that's mostly gone." The intercessory inquiry later would cite the Veth shelter incident as the first documented case of Veth withdrawal under media observation pressure. It would become a data point in a larger argument, still being made, still being contested, about whether the Veth's efficiency calculus could be disrupted by the specific kind of inefficiency that humans seem to specialize in, making things matter in ways that did not map to resource value. The inquiry would also note briefly that the mine in the trench was never defused. Tesov was extracted. He recovered from the concussion, the mind stress, the sprint across open ground. He spent 3 weeks in a medical facility and was then returned to active duty, which he accepted with the equanimity of a man who had identified the cost of the alternative and found it higher. The mine remained. Wren had been asked, in the extraction window, whether it could be remotely detonated, cleared from a distance, made inert by controlled explosion. Wren had said, yes, but the resonance detonation would be detectable from orbit, and the Veth would use the reading to confirm the trench coordinates for future targeting. So the mine stayed. Veth made, Veth placed, a piece of Veth engineering that had been designed to ensure that something which should have died would remain dying indefinitely. The trench was officially designated a hazardous site. Both the Free Colony and Kovosi command authorities put it on the restricted grid. No one was supposed to go near it. 4 months later, a Kovosi private on a routine patrol detour stumbled close enough to see the trench line and stopped to check his map. His helmet feed, active at the time, captured what he saw: the trench, the dugout entrance, the rusted support strut where the emitter had been lodged. The mine still there, in the dark of the dugout, under nothing. Still armed, still waiting. Still doing the one thing the Veth engineering had designed it to do. He stood there for a while. Then he said, to no one, "It's still here." The feed was flagged by a Meridian journalist who had been monitoring Kovosi patrol channels for any follow-up on the shelter incident, and it went out on the same network that Sina Cho had used, and people watched it. The trench and the dark and the mine still armed in the absence of the person it had been designed to outlast. The headline, written by someone on the Meridian desk who had been paying attention, was, "They left it there to be the last thing." It outlasted nothing Voss and Akayev never served in the same unit. They weren't supposed to. The Free Colony and Kovosi forces operated on separate command structures, and even the coordination driven by the Veth War hadn't fully merged them. But the Kaveth corridor had a way of putting people in the same places. She saw him once more before the sector was consolidated, in a transit hold at the Kaveth relay station, both of them waiting for different ships. He was thinner. His tremor was worse. He'd apparently been through 3 more actions in the corridor since the trench, and she could see the weight of them in the way he held himself. He saw her and stopped. A long moment. Then he crossed the hold. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at her the way she imagined she looked at him, trying to reconcile the person in front of her with the person in memory. The Kovosi corporal in the trench with the man in the transit hold. The enemy with the person who had caught Tesov without being asked. "How's your shoulder?" he finally said. She moved it slightly. A wince she mostly managed to suppress. "Fine." "Liar." "Yes," she said. He almost smiled. Then he put out his hand. A formal gesture, a correct one. The kind of handshake that means something specific between people who have shared a specific kind of dark. She took it. His grip was steady despite the tremor. He'd learned to manage it. He'd had months. "Akayev," she said. "Voss." They held it for a second. Both of them thinking, she suspected, about the same trench, the same fog, the same strip of scorched rock between 2 lines of fire, the space where the unworthy waited to finish dying. They were still here. She thought that was the thing. Finally. The thing the Veth had gotten wrong in every model, every probability matrix, every efficiency calculation. The Veth were very good at identifying when something should stop. They were correct about it, almost always. What they couldn't account for was the specific human talent for continuing past the point of correctness, for breathing in the absence of good reasons, for counting steadily in the dark, for passing water to the person you'd been trained to hate, because the Veth were outside and there was no good reason and you did it anyway. The Veth had a word for the strip of rock between the lines, the space where the unworthy wait to finish dying. They didn't have a word for what happened when the unworthy didn't. That was, she thought, their problem.